All right, we're going to continue verifying trig identities. These are definitely going to be a little bit more challenging. Um, just the fact that we got these fractions and they're not very pretty. So, first one. We are trying to put these things together to combine it all into simplify it all the way down to just cotangent squared. So no matter what, we're going to have to figure out, we're going to need common denominators and we're going to need to put things together. So, the secant minus 1 I feel like I recognize. Well, we're not quite there. So we have a secant squared minus 1 is equal to tangent squared. So if I can just make this become this denominator, we'd have common denominators. So what can I multiply secant minus 1 to make secant squared minus 1? And I can actually multiply it by its conjugate. So let me rewrite this. So we're not going to do anything to the second fraction yet, because we're going to get a common denominator. We're going to get tangent squared out of the one on the left. So we're going to multiply this by secant theta plus 1, called the conjugate. The conjugate's going to multiply out, middles are going to cancel, and you're going to get this. So, and this is not the only way to do this, but it's just kind of the route that I kind of saw. So if you multiply the top, you got cosine times secant. Those are reciprocals of each other. So when you distribute that in, that's going to cancel. So you're going to get a 1 plus cosine on the top. And on the bottom, you're going to get secant squared. Let's just write that out. You're going to get secant squared and then minus secant, and then plus secant, and then minus 1. So there's your conjugate, and your middle pieces always cancel on the conjugate. So you got secant squared minus 1. So and then minus our cosine theta over tangent squared theta. Okay, so if I start to put that together, I have secant squared minus 1 is tangent theta. So this is really tangent squared. So I can sub that out because you now have common denominators. So that is tangent squared, so I can put the tops together. 1 plus cosine theta minus cosine theta. And these pieces cancel each other away. You're left with 1 over tangent squared. And that is cotangent squared, which is exactly where we're looking to go. All right. And then this one, again, we kind of have these denominators that don't have anything to do with each other, but they're not like at all, so we have to actually just multiply them to each other. So for our first fraction, 1 plus cosine of theta minus 1 minus cosine of theta. And we're trying to, again, put them together because there's no addition going on this side, so somehow they have to go together. And this one is, they're just going to multiply to each other. But when we multiply to each other, they are, again, going to be conjugates. So this idea of a conjugate gives you these kinds of looks of things, of secant squareds minus 1s, 1 minus cosine squareds, those types of things. So it has a tendency to use conjugates on these types of problems. Okay, so the top, nothing really happened to the top. It's just 1 minus cosine times 1. So 1 minus cosine. Now the bottom, though, if we FOIL that out, distribute it all together, we got a 1 times a 1. So that's 1. 1 times cosine is cosine theta. And then a negative cosine theta times 1, and then a negative cosine squared on both of these two denominators. So again, since they're common denominators, or since it was a conjugate, those middle pieces cancel out, and you're just left with 1 minus cosine squared. And then when you do the other one, you're going to have a 1 times 1 plus cosine, and then 1 minus cosine squared. Okay, so we have our common denominator. We're going to put pieces together. So it's 1 minus cosine squared theta. Now, one thing I would do, because I see people do this, I see students make mistakes on this all the time, we don't do this math right. We do a 1 minus 1 correctly, but then we don't do a negative cosine minus a cosine. So what I do to just make sure I don't miss the second that you're subtracting all the pieces on here is I will distribute that sign to everything to make sure I don't miss it. So if you feel like you're getting this wrong, it's probably because you're not subtracting the second piece. So distribute the negative in, and that should take care of it. So you have a 1 minus a 1, those go away, and you have a negative cosine minus another cosine, so that's negative 2 cosine. Okay, so we're still trying to figure out where we're going. Here's our negative 2, that's a good sign. This cotangent cosecant, I don't know. It's got to be something with this, because this doesn't have a denominator anymore, so whatever's in the denominator has to come up. And it's this piece, this 1 minus cosine squared, is sine squared. So we can rewrite that as negative 2 cosine theta sine squared theta. And then actually I'm going to break this up just to make things a little bit more straightforward. Sine squared theta is sine theta sine theta. And then if you're looking for this, your cosecant is actually one of those, and cotangent is cosine over sine. So here's our cosine over sine. So that's cotangent. And then your sine can just come up and become cosecant. All right, so both of those are definitely a little bit more challenging. Here, you just had to multiply them to each other. Here, it was recognizing that, that can be manipulated a little bit to become a tangent squared by multiplying by the conjugate and then subbing it out. And then here, they end up being conjugates of each other, so then the denominator works out to be pretty nice, because that's something then we can substitute in, or substitute out into something simpler. All right, that was verifying trig identities.